Alright guys, I'm going to try to explain this to you in PowerPoint slides. We've been talking about the Civil War the last couple weeks. One of the things you should understand is this idea of federalism. Federalism being the government is split into basically the national, state, and local levels, meaning there's a government, like the federal government at the national level in Washington, D.C. with the president. At the state level, each state has its own government with governors. And then at the local level, we have different, mayors of our cities and whatnot. So when we talk about the Civil War, when it comes to federalism, there was a very big dispute over, power when it came to slavery. Was slavery going to continue? When we added new states to the United States, was it going to be a slave state or a free state? And as it says here, since the founding of the country, and particularly with the end of the American Civil War, power shifted away from the states and toward the national government. A lot of that coming from, the disputes before the Civil War when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, we talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I know that stuff can be kind of confusing, so I want to explain that stuff some more. So the Missouri Compromise was United States federal legislation that admitted Maine to the United States as a free state, while admitting Missouri as a slave state. That balanced the power between the North and the South. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at this map, you see the states in red are free states. In blue, there's slave states. This is open territory. The United States, these have not become states yet. So as we expanded westward and started to turn these territories into new states, the question became, should it be free, should it be slave? So the Missouri Compromise basically added Missouri as a slave state, but then that left the balance of free and slave states uneven. So to balance that out, they added Maine, which is up here in this corner up here, as a free state. So now you had the same amount of free states and you had the same amount of slave states in the United States. And that really is important and significant because in Congress there is a balance of power, meaning, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate especially, the Senate, there are 2 representatives from every state. In the House of Representatives, it's more balanced on population. But that created a very big dispute. And when we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically, and that'll be in the next slide, but let me talk about this first. The Missouri Compromise did not allow slavery in any portion north of basically this line here. So when we look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, let me first read this to you first. It was passed by the U.S. Congress on May 30th, 1854. It allowed people in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. So if we go back to this idea of federalism, we're talking about this idea that, okay, the national government has power, the states have power, the local governments have power. This is basically undoing the Missouri Compromise because look at this. Here's the line that they drew, but now the Kansas-Nebraska Act has undone that because they've just added these 2 sections to the United States, and now they're basically saying, hey, you guys can decide for yourselves if you want to be free or if you want to be slave states. So here's where it gets messy, because the election of 1860 with Abraham Lincoln, he basically was, how can I put it? He didn't necessarily want to keep slavery, but he wasn't necessarily for it either. Over the course of his presidency, that started to change, and as we get into the Civil War, obviously with the Emancipation Proclamation, that was an edict to end that, and then legislation was passed to end it completely. But what made people upset is that they basically undid the Missouri Compromise and said, hey, you know what, just pick for yourselves. Well, people in the North were not very happy about that. People in the South wanted to keep slavery, mainly as a part of their culture. They were agricultural. They used slaves to pick their crops, and the North was very much more industrial, so it wasn't really a necessity at all. And so once people in the South realized that Abraham Lincoln was more on the end of, this idea that, slavery might not stick around anymore, that was it. I mean, once he became president, They were done. They started to look at it as a threat to their way of life, to their society, to their culture, and they split. And that's when they basically, they seceded from the Union. So, as new states were added, the issue of slavery became more debated, and the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 laid the final groundwork for the American Civil War. Like we said, they weren't happy with his feelings towards it. Now, granted, like we said, he wasn't necessarily completely against it, but he did believe that, African Americans, slaves, they did have that they should have the ability to make their way in society. And as we talked about before, and you guys read about and watched, the Emancipation Proclamation freed them, but only kind of in an unofficial sense. Like you said, after the war, legislation had to be added, an amendment had to be added to the Constitution to make that official.